On today's episode, updates to your investor policy statement. What does it mean that you're putting additional emphasis on equal weighting inside of your index funds, burpees, breathing, and more? Welcome to the ultimate crowdsourced personal finance show. This is ChooseFI. All right, guys, super excited to dive into this week's episode. Got a lot to cover, a lot of fun stuff, kind of rounding out a conversation that we've been having about setting up your financial life, and then taking your mailbag questions. And help me with this, I have my co-host Brad here with me today. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, Jonathan, I am doing quite well. Yeah, always excited to be here. Not quite as excited as you.
I've spilled my water in anticipation of this conversation. I'm just like, oh, let's get started and do it.
Yeah, that was great. I saw the water just land in a big puddle on your shirt. That was impressive. But
One of those.
hey, what can you do? But yeah, everything's going well. It's hard to believe it's almost the middle of December already, Jonathan. Time flies, and I'm actually doing. I don't think I mentioned this to you before just now, but I'm doing a month-long burpee challenge. The physical fitness exercise burpees, in case anybody's out there wondering what that word actually is, with Alan and Katie Donegan.
You know, as you were saying that, I was thinking to myself, people probably don't know what a burpee is. It's an exercise, technique, or movement. It's the bane of many people's existence, and it's something that you can do with no equipment that will probably have a higher impact on your long-term health than almost anything else that you can imagine. So, Brad, I guess if you're going to give someone a general idea, and everybody can just Google this is truly it. But why is this so powerful, so infrequently done, and probably the one big thing that someone could incorporate in their life this week to make a drastic difference over time?
Yeah, that is that's quite a setup. Hopefully I can do it justice here with words. But yeah, I mean, a burpee is essentially a full body exercise, and like you said, it is the bane of many CrossFitter and other exercisers' lives here. But you start in a standing position. You basically put your hands down on the ground and do like a squat thrust. So you're like kicking your legs back. So you're in like a plank position. This is all happening very quickly, but I'm trying to describe piece by piece. And then you mostly do a push-up down to the ground. Some people do flop down to the ground, but I think a control down to the ground would be ideal. And then you're lifting yourself back up into kind of that plank position and then jumping your legs forward. So you're back in a kind of crouched position, if you will. And then you leap out of this into basically a standing jump. So, I mean, that is about as full body of an exercise as one can come up with. Jonathan, did I do it any kind of justice there?
You really did. Much of what you described is not what I have done in the few times that I have either been forced to do it or tried it on my own. I definitely incorporated the flop, and I don't think I've ever leaped at the end in my entire life. I do more of like the Hudson Shuffle. You know, it's just like, all right, let's go to the next one. You know, and I'm just trying to get through it. But to your point, it's interesting. You brought this up today that you're doing this challenge from Alan and Katie, Alan Donegan, Katie Donegan from Rebel Entrepreneur, good friends of the show. And it struck me that literally yesterday, I walked down midday. I was in the middle of work. I walked down to my wife. She's with our kids at that particular point in time, and I suggested to Danny that we go ahead and do 20 burpees. Danny, let's just do 20 burpees. Like right now, let's just do it. And right there in the spot, we broke up our routine and we just did 20 burpees. And I have to, I don't know where that, at the time, I didn't really know where that inspiration came from. But if I would really think about it, it was probably because Alan and Katie shared on their Facebook thread that they were doing this burpee challenge. And probably I saw you comment on it and it planted that seed. You know what, Jonathan, you should probably go do some burpees, even though you hate burpees. Like, go do something hard today and every day thereafter. There's something there, Brad. A long time ago, I remember you saying, like, imagine how different your world would be if every day you just went and did 10 burpees a day. Forget everything else. People want you to sign up for a gym. They want you to take this radical approach. Imagine what would change about your life if you just took on the challenge of doing 10 burpees a day every day for a year.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it really is an amazing exercise that you can do really quickly, and I think that's another nice aspect of it. You can do it in little bite-sized increments, and clearly we are not exercise professionals, Jonathan. We're not trying to say like this is the be-all end-all. This is just something that I've found works for me. And to your point about like doing something difficult, I was actually so taken by that video that Alan and Katie posted on Facebook that they were doing synchronized burpees, and at the end, they were jumping higher than I've seen anybody ever jump at the end of a burpee before. And I have to say, like, that was an aha moment for me. And I know this sounds weird, but like it genuinely was because I mean, I exercise a decent amount. Like I'm in pretty good shape, but yet I have never even contemplated doing one burpee at the level, the degree of difficulty that Alan and Katie were doing it and are continuing to do their burpees every single rep. And, it made me actually think. Like I was watching this 15-second video, but like it kind of it was like it was that change everything type moment of, wow, you mean I'm getting up and exercising 30, 40 minutes a day, but in my mind, I'm always holding back something. Like I have this internal regulator, I think, that's somehow keeping me back from, I don't know, maybe exhausting myself or whatever it is, whatever weird thing I've got going on in my brain. But would it look like to live life doing everything like Alan and Katie do burpees? Like what would it look like if you actually gave your all to things on a regular basis? Like, I mean, that again, I know this sounds silly, but hopefully everybody's hearing me and taking in the point of like, really, what would it look like to give your all to something? And I think there's really a nugget of wisdom in there that a lot of us can take that clearly transcends just this burpee or anything physical. Just give your all to something.
I am guilty of that as well. Even when I'm doing the burpees, I look for the easy
Yeah.
way out, right? Like
Oh
I'm trying
yeah.
to get to a number like 20 as opposed to let me do something really hard to the point where I won't even be able to complete the 20. Like you could do a 20 and make it as minimal as possible, or you could do 8 and just be toast, absolute toast. And I usually am more stuck on the end result, getting to the number I had in mind than the actual quality of the movement or the motion or how much. And I think it's kind of losing sight of the forest for the trees. It's focusing on results instead of systems, process, workflow. And this is really it. Humans, you and I, all of us, we are creatures of habit. We follow a narrative. There's a belief system about ourselves. And if we're not intentional about the narrative that we're following, the belief system that we're following, we just let other people tell us what to believe. We just take the easiest path possible. In order to go to that point, like you said, that aha moment, it almost needs to be thrust upon you. I don't need to I don't need to go the easy route. I don't need to follow the script that has maybe already been selected for me. I can try something different. And I tell you what, nothing will shake you out of your current narrative than saying right now, I'm going to pause this podcast and go do 10. I'm going to go Google it. What the hell is a burpee? And then I'm going to go do
Yeah.
10 of them to the best of my ability. That is a shock to your system. It truly is. Like from that point on, you have in some tiny little way cast a vote of confidence that you're about to become a different person, or you are in the process of becoming a different person. You just made a little tiny vote for the person that you want to become because you wouldn't have done that normally. That wasn't on your radar. We all have these patterns that we follow. We go to work from 9 to 5. We spend 30 to 40 minutes inside of a commute. We get home, we de-stress for an hour. We throw on Netflix. We spend $100 on Amazon. We wait till the weekends to do our laundry, and then we go get Panda Express once every 3 weeks. That's the narrative. That's the script. And we just do that. Try throwing a burpee into your life, 10 of them today. That wasn't in the narrative. That wasn't in the script. And then say, oh, wow, I could actually do anything I want with these years that I've been handed. What else do I want to do? What else do I want to try? Brad, I think over the last 6 to 8 months, that's kind of, in a way, that's kind of what I feel like I've done in my own life. And burpees, obviously, we're talking about it's a tiny little sliver of this. You can do so many different things. But until you're willing to kind of analyze it and look at it, you won't. You're just going to take the easy path. What else are we not challenging? What else are we not questioning? I know that was a hard stop, buddy. But I think really we're hoping someone will actually do a burpee right now just to go test this
Yeah.
theory
No,
out.
that would be impressive. And send us an email. Send us an email. Like do that for a week. Do that for 2 weeks. Like you said, these little habits. I think that's what we've tried to talk about a lot here at ChooseFI is it is truly, we usually say it metaphorically, but getting up off the couch and taking action. Here we're talking about getting up off the couch and doing something for your physical fitness, but it is get up off the couch and do something, no matter how small it is, that's going to make your life better in some way. It might be sending a text to a friend you haven't talked to in a couple years, right? Like what does that cost you? That costs you 15 seconds. But man, I can tell you for sure, I got a text from a buddy of mine a couple weeks ago that I hadn't spoken to in a year or two, and it felt so nice to be thought of, genuinely. Like, that made my entire day. And I mean, that was just really, that was 15 seconds of his time. I mean, what does it look like if you do that to somebody every single day, right? Reach out to somebody. You could talk about just tiny little things. Obviously, with your finances, that's, this theoretically is a personal finance show. There's so many little things you can do to stop drifting, right? We always talk about subscriptions. We talk about getting rid of convenience, planning your meals, doing something like that that's just going to make your life better. So I think that's why, Jonathan, we always talk about these habits, these little things, the 1% better, right? Like these phrases we use over and over again because they're so critically important to living a better life. It's stacking hundreds of these things. It's not about the massive, like, I'm going to run a marathon tomorrow. Like, the world doesn't work that way. You get better incrementally. You get better truly fractions of a percent at a time.
Brad, this content is actually building. I'm sure you could reference it, but we did this episode with James Clear, author of Atomic Habits, who's really, talking about some of these concepts. And you've in the past referenced Tom Bilyeu, talking about what's the story you tell yourself about yourself. Uh, us kind of getting a chance to work through this at a personal level as it applies to us as individuals, to take it out of like theory and then make it real life. What are you doing has really been profound for me personally. And I know for you as well, but just examples in my own life of things that I've done. I started to look at all those tiny little choices that we never question. And we just talked about the exercise component just a little bit here. And I think everybody knows like no one, no one got out of shape by having a single donut. But if you were to eat a donut every single day for a year, that is going to fundamentally transform who you are as a person in a very, very profound way. Much in the same way that someone that makes the choice to cut out, it's such a small choice. Like they have soda, they cut out soda that day and they replace that with water. And then they decide my main drink of choice going forward, instead of soda or beer, is going to be water. I'm going to drink water, more water. It's a tiny little choice. That little thing right there over a period of a year is transformative. Someone that says, on average, the average American family watches on average 4 hours of television a day. That's how the TV is on for 4 hours a day. An individual that says that I'm not going to do that. I'm going to cap myself at 30 minutes, at 20 minutes, at one show, or I'm going to get overlap. And if I'm going to watch TV, it's going to be while I'm exercising in some capacity. That's the only way I can have it on. It will not make a difference in that moment. But again, over the period of a couple months, over the period of a year, especially when stacked with some of these other things, fundamentally transforms who you are. We call this the aggregation of marginal gains. This community is incredibly receptive to this idea. It's the idea that we like to talk about and identify the massive actions. It's so easy to marginalize or ignore the small actions, but you realize the small actions build on top of themselves and they lead to something fantastic. And this is how we get, back into personal finance because it's not, obviously we're talking about through the lens of health. It's not siloed to health. This is the exact same principles that apply to your finances. We've actually been building on this content for the last couple of weeks, doing our kind of back to the basics series. And then this past week, we had this awesome conversation on how to start your financial life. And that was building on an episode we did talking about the power of compounding interest. And in that, over those two episodes, I was sharing, how I've actually been taking my current understanding of, how the world works and my current understanding of my risk tolerance, which has to some degree changed over the last year, and how I've been going back and having conversations with my wife about how, if and how, what changes we would want to make to our investor policy statement. Again, building on the content we did with Frank, where we basically said the time to, if you're going to make a change in your investing strategy, it is not when, the sky has fallen and it's not working, because that is the epitome of you, buying high and selling low. But if you are going to make strategies, if you are going to make changes, you want to wait till you're more or less at steady state again, unless things are going pretty well. And we are kind of in that place. And so now my wife and I are having this conversation. And what's interesting is, regardless of whether you're changing your strategy or you're simply getting started investing, which is kind of the thread here, it's important to have this type of conversations. Whether you're making changes to your current investor policy statement or you're creating one from scratch, this is a fantastic, just general time to go back and address it and take a look at what is our plan. So, Brad, I thought we could kind of build on that conversation. And I'd be happy to share kind of where my wife and I are headed with what we're planning on doing. But I'd be curious in terms of, I know you have a very simplified one. You have a very simplified version of this. You and Laura, your investing plan, if not your actual policy statement. What is your simple? If you were going to explain this to a friend or family member, what your plan is for your investments over a period of 10 or 15 or 20 or 45 years, what would that look like encapsulated in a 2-minute conversation?
Yeah, that's a good question, Jonathan. I mean, I think for me, I would start even outside of the individual equities or index funds that I'm investing in, and say that really the overarching principle is we believe in thinking long term, we believe in lowering expenses, and we believe in continually investing. I think that's something that we try to do, is set up things on autopilot so that my and Laura's, our brains are out of the way. Okay. So I think setting it up so that we can't sabotage ourselves is something critical. So while that might not sound like a direct answer to your question, Jonathan, I think that that would be the start of how I would start that conversation is, I set this up so that any extra money is getting swept into, in my case, Vanguard, every basically every 2 weeks, and it's just getting invested regularly. So that said, I think I would say, largely speaking, I am invested almost entirely in low cost index funds. In most cases, they are total stock market index funds where I have them available. S&P 500 when I don't have total stock market index available. I uh, just based on some things that I had done previously, I do have some exposure to some bonds and some international, and I think that's perfectly plausible. Um, I have expanded to some single family real estate rentals, as I've talked about on the podcast a couple of times. So I now own 2 single family rentals. So that's a not insignificant portion of our overall investing strategy. And I guess I also am looking into different types of like crowdfunding real estate ventures as well that are online. I think Fundrise and Peer Street are some of the more popular ones. So that's something that I'm kind of dabbling in, I would say. But overall, index fund investing is the significant majority of what we're doing. Again, with the backbone of this being just a continual process of putting money in, but also learning, Jonathan. And I think that's part of where you are specifically right now is taking in new information and figuring out what your tolerance is and making wise decisions from hopefully a point where you're not just emotionally reacting, right? I think that's what you would advocate.
Yeah, I think that's pretty close to where I stand as well. So so I think if I were going to give someone a 2-minute, version of my general long-term investing plan, it would be exactly the same thing. Buy as much diversity as possible, hold for the long term, avoid fees, avoid very expensive, actively managed funds, expense ratios, avoid avoid high-end expense ratios, and try to put as much of this on autopilot as possible. So we were talking about just, this past week when you're setting up your financial life, you go and you look at your employer's options if they have a 401k, and you look for low expense ratio options, or you look for index funds potentially. And, I usually pick from those options, and then I kind of work my way down. And we said all index funds are not created equal. You could have a total stock market index fund, which would be basically all the publicly traded companies inside the United States, around 3,200 companies. You could have an S&P 500, which are the 500 largest companies inside the United States. Some companies will offer a small cap, meaning smaller companies by their value, by their market capitalization. You could have a medium cap. You could have value companies, which are companies that, for whatever reason, are considered to be out of favor. There's a bunch of different indexes that are out there, but the key is that they are programmed on the front end to follow a certain algorithm to match whatever the market is doing. And they don't have an expensive team that's running them, that's making decisions on when to get in and when to get out, which reduces your fees, which effectively keeps money in your pocket. And one other thing that we just mentioned in passing was that there was a difference between, a total stock market index fund and a S&P 500 index fund are cap weighted, meaning you own a disproportionate amount of the largest companies, which, at least over the last 10 years has actually worked dramatically in your favor because the largest companies have carried the vast majority of returns. You've made a lot of money by being in these types of funds. But over a longer stretch of period, like 20, 30, or 40 years, a lot of the returns have been driven by small cap, by smaller companies. And so the question is, is what's going to be driving the returns in the future? And so a lot of investors that have focused on these small and these mid caps, or rather have tried to be equally weighted, they've kind of been left behind on the returns over the last 5, 6, 7 years. Now, the reason I did that setup is to say that I kind of did a horse race. It used to be very hard if you wanted to have a more complex portfolio. It used to require a lot more time to be able to set this up and to maintain it to whatever percentages that you wanted. And that was yet another reason just to focus on simplicity, the simple path to wealth, buy a total stock market index fund. Since the advent of some of the modern day, I guess you'd call them robo advisors. I don't know if that's the perfect term or not, but since the day of like kind of these modern interfaces, M1 Finance probably being my known favorite, but there's others out there like Betterment, Wealthfront. There's several that have a more intuitive interface that can allow you to decide what type of portfolio you want and then keep it. It has become almost too easy to just pick a very complex portfolio and then set and forget. And so, probably about a year ago, I decided to run a horse race and do inside of a piece of my portfolio, run 50% of my investments went into just a total stock market index fund, and the other 50% went into something that's equal weighted. And I will give you a better definition of what that actually looked like. I followed one of Paul Merriman's portfolios, which is easy to find on M1. We can have a link. But he talks about several funds, and basically we're going to split our money up evenly between the large cap, the medium cap, the small cap, the value companies, international. I mean, just breaks it up into a bunch of different pies, and you put an equal amount of money into each of those. And to be fair, Paul Merriman's portfolio got crushed. I mean, it did. It got totally crushed. And anybody that was kind of going through this process from March till now, when COVID hit, would actually be able to identify the small businesses. As you know, small businesses got hammered. Large businesses, because they have gotten a little bit more favor, they got a little bit more funding. Typically, those businesses also were a little bit less limited by geographic region or by foot traffic in some capacity. Those businesses did, like Netflix. Netflix didn't care about COVID, right? Netflix did great with COVID.
Amazon jumps to mind, right?
Amazon did just fine with COVID, right? These types of companies. Apple didn't get hurt too badly with COVID. These types of companies, not all of them. And some got, like Disney got kind of hammered, but Disney had Disney Plus now. They did just fine with COVID. These types of companies just totally crushed it. And these small businesses got hammered. Having said that, though, and this is the thing, we're not necessarily interested in returns over a 1 year, 2 year, 5 year. We're looking at it over a 10 year. And typically, most of us know that when something gets hammered, now it's on sale. It's a value, right? There's value there. You're buying it dramatically on sale. So the question is, generally, just for me, I'm not telling you what as the audience would do, but I am giving you my mindset. And this is the conversation I'm having with my wife going into next year and the year after and the year after. If I continue to buy these large companies like Amazon, which have become twice as expensive as they were before, or Tesla, which is 7 or 8 times as expensive, these types of things. Even if I buy like a total stock market index fund or beyond, I'm buying very expensive companies at a very expensive premium, hoping that they will then still be able to continue to do that in order to give me those returns. The converse is also true. These companies that got crushed are effectively on a fire sale because their business models in many cases are burning up. They're they're higher risk, but they're on sale right now. And what's my exposure to them? Do we have a way to benefit? I don't have an answer, clearly. Do not have a crystal ball here. Do not know what's going to happen. But what I do know, and we talked about this a little bit, is these cap-weighted funds, you own a disproportionate amount of these large companies, these large tech companies, a lot more than you might even think that you do. And so with my wife, we were just saying, going into 2021, do we like our current plan? Do we want to make some small tweaks? And here is kind of what we came up with that we are okay with. One, I don't like the idea of just sitting on a ton of cash. Everybody knows this. I'm a little bit more like skeptical of the power of an emergency fund that's just massively overfunded when that emergency fund is sitting in cash in a savings account making 0.45%. That just doesn't feel super good to me. It might be good in the very, very short term, like 1 month, 2 months, 6 months. But when you're talking about a 1 year or 2 year or 3 year emergency fund, it's like, oh, I don't know about that. Conversely, though, you might need that money. And so that's where when Frank joined us on the show, and he was talking about this idea of negative correlation and why people invest in different things, talking about different bonds, talking about precious metals, that sort of thing. He was saying, when you're talking about diversity, one of you can have diversity for different reasons. You could have diversity for stability, you could have diversity for income, and you could have diversity for negative correlation. Negative correlation really appealed to me because my emergency fund, the goal of that thing is for it to hopefully either hold steady or go up when the market goes down. And I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit of returns to get that. So here's what we came up with. Brad, do you have any questions? You want to like push back on anything that I know I'm there's a lot that I'm trying to lay out here and I don't want to just monopolize too much.
No, no, no.
Anything you want to
No,
say
I
there?
think it's a good explanation so far. I one thing I did want to clarify was when you were saying in M1 finance, and we do have a review at choosefi.com/M1. Jonathan, I know you're a huge fan of it. You said you had split 50-50 between Paul Merriman and the standard index funds. And just to be clear, that's not, you don't have all of your assets in M1, right? This is just a horse race test that you were setting up.
Great question. You're absolutely right. I do not. And even more than that, even inside of M1, that does not necessarily make up 100% of my portfolio. What's brilliant about M1 is you can set up pies, right? So you could have a pies for equities. And inside that equity, so some percentage of my net worth goes, or some percentage of my investable income goes into this first pie, which is equities. And inside this equity, it's split between this horse race, one going to like a simple path and the other going towards like an equal weighted approach. So great point. And you're right. I have 401ks that are with large institutional firms like Vanguard, Fidelity, Schwab. M1 is what I'm doing for my taxable investments, although I think they do allow you to do some rollover. So you can roll over your IRA into there, et cetera. Great question. Okay. So I'm just going to look at it through the lens of M1 finance right now specifically, because to your also credit to your point that you made there, your options are somewhat limited with some of these institutional investments. You don't have the ability to run more complex portfolios unless you're willing to do the work and check in on them a little bit more frequently. So I might make some small changes in there, but I recognize that I want to keep it as simple as possible inside of those because I rarely go in and check and see how they're doing. I want to know generally what they're invested in, but I don't want to be maintaining 20, 30 different funds and strategies and that sort of thing. Whereas M1 will just maintain the logic that I set up on the front side. All right. So inside of M1 Finance, I've set up 3 pies. I've set up a negative correlation pie. That's just what I called it. And I'll get into that in just a second. I set up a can I pick pie, which is just my ability. If I want to have a little, like a percentage going into just stocks that I think are going to do well, then that's what I put into it. And then I have a equities play, an equities play. So this is, just going into the stock market, going into usually index funds. They are index funds, but the index funds are like smaller index funds. They represent certain segments of the market. And so inside of this scenario that I have laid out, the can I pick pie, which is just what I'm limiting my capacity to pick and choose companies. I have that capped at 10%. And then my next pie, which is the equities pie, right now I have 50% going into this equities and stock market. And then I have 40% going into this negative correlation pie right now. And again, this is not my entire portfolio. And this is only an example. This is not investing advice. This is just inside of M1 as an example. I wanted to share with the audience kind of what I was thinking and how it might map out. So the can I pick pie, and please, I want anybody listening to this, I'm just sharing for the sake of transparency, just kind of how I went about picking things and what we came up with. This is a somewhat smaller piece of my invested assets. So this is not a full picture of everything that I have going on. And I'm not trying to give you financial advice or make recommendations. I'm just being transparent about a little bit of what I have invested in. Please do your own research before making any, investing choices. So just a little disclaimer here as I kind of start to share this with you. All right. So in the can I pick pie, these are companies that I use, that I'm familiar with, that I see a future for, and I have a little bit in Tesla, a little bit in Adobe. So Tesla, everybody knows who Tesla is and what they're doing. Adobe is the subscription service that well, frankly, we're producing this show on Audition, Premiere, and so much more. I mean, Adobe is in a lot of different spaces, but they have a software subscription. They are basically like anybody that's in the creation industry has to lean on their software. It seems like they have a pretty big moat. My house is filled with Roku TVs, and so I have a little bit in Roku. We go to Costco every weekend, so I have a little bit invested in Costco, and Apple devices are everywhere, so we have a little bit in Apple. There's no huge surprises here. I haven't done a ton of research. I don't know a ton about these companies. I just have kind of a belief in their use case. I see how they're used. I see why they're going to continue to get stronger in the future. Minimal amount of research done, which is also why I cap my confidence. This is a very tiny piece of my investing assets is with them. And the key is not to chase returns, because Tesla is up something like 660% over the last several years. Now you could be like, well, I'm just going to go all in on Tesla. Well, no, because that means that you're paying 660% more than someone that started 6 years ago, was it? So it's very easy when you see something doing well just to throw more money at it, not recognizing that you're just buying at 660% higher than someone else. Doesn't mean it's going to go up 660% over the next year or the next year. So chasing returns is very dangerous for us as individual investors, which is why we want to be able to have some sort of logic in there that says, up to a certain percentage, this is what I'm going to invest on a regular basis. And it prevents you from going down that really dangerous and expensive rabbit hole of always chasing returns. So if I were to back out of this 10% piece and I were to go look at the negative correlation and the equities, let's go look at the equities first, because that's the more complicated of the two. And this is all just basically from Merriman. And Brad, I'll give you some of the ticker symbols and we can talk about them again, just giving you examples of kind of what Paul Merriman talks about, but to see kind of how it allows you to get, because we say equal weighting, but what does that actually mean? These ticker symbols are in some cases actively managed, in some cases they're just index funds, but they represent different segments of the market that achieve different things.
And Jonathan, one thing that I want to jump in here with is kind of the question that I'd be asking if I was a listener, which is, I guess, what's the ultimate goal of what you're doing here? Is it the negative correlation? Is it partially just to learn more about companies and kind of dabble, which is not a ridiculous notion, right? We've spoken with Brian Feraldi, who multiple times on the show. I think episode 75, episode 200, I think 122R also. And he talked about individual stock investing, right? And he is a significant believer in it. And he does obviously a ton of research, but even still, he doesn't put the vast majority of his assets in individual stocks. He's still a believer in index funds primarily, but he does have clearly a more significant portion of his total investments in individual equities than I do, let's say. But so I guess like that's my question to you, is more than just getting into like the individual pieces in that negative correlation, like what's the overall point? And I guess what percentage are you like, is this like a test? Is it like, okay, I want to allocate X percent of my overall assets to this? Like, talk me through that more importantly.
Great. Okay. So I think in order to truly appreciate when I'm talking about M1, I'm not talking about everything I have invested. I think it's important to point out that I do not have a significant emergency fund. I am not sitting on multiple years of cash, right? I have enough for a couple months of cash flow. So my M1 specifically, keeping in mind that most of my net worth is all inside of like 401k vehicles going into low cost broad-based index funds. My M1 is twofold. It's a growth machine, hopefully, but it's also acting as a form of my emergency fund. So that means that if the market completely tanks, I need to be able to hold the line to some varying degree. So my M1 looks a little bit more conservative than my 401ks do, which obviously I'm not going to be touching for a while, right? They're just all on growth. So, I think that was my thought process. M1 is something that I view it as fungible income. It could be in this M1 account. It could be in my savings account. My savings account is not very attractive right now. So M1, I need it to be there, but I also need to know that like in the medium term, specifically the short term, if something goes awry, if we experience another COVID March type thing, I'm going to be happy with that, or I'm going to be happy with what's in there, and I'll be able to utilize that effectively as an emergency fund. So that's my point of distinction, I think.
Okay, I gotcha. And just to be perfectly clear to the audience, like there is nothing magical or special about M1, right? It's so when Jonathan was just describing it, like M1 is not a type of investment, clearly. This is something it's akin to a Vanguard or Schwab or Fidelity. It's a place where you can invest your money. And I think what Jonathan is arguing is that if you are looking to have different strategies or dabble in things, M1 facilitates it in your estimation, better than any company you've ever used, especially with those pies. You used that terminology before, and a lot of people probably don't know exactly what that means. But as opposed to having to go in and individually buy, like, hey, I want to buy one share of Apple or I want to buy one share of Disney or whatever it may be, you set up this pie that may have, in your case, whatever, X number of companies, 8 companies. And if you put $100 in, it buys fractional shares of each of those companies in the percentage that you've set up in that pie. So I think, again, there is nothing overly special about M1 in the sense that it's a magical investment. That's not what it is. But what they do in a wonderful way is facilitate investing down to a level of granularity, I think, that you as an individual investor probably would not be able to get anywhere else.
You're absolutely 100% right. Yep. And I would imagine you could replicate something similar, although I am very partial to this platform, with Betterment or Wealthfront, a few of those. Okay. So we've covered that. So again, we're talking about this. I view, and I think this is a huge point. I view my taxable investments. I view what I'm investing outside of my 401k, outside of my Roth IRA. I view this as another form of savings. It's my money. I can access it whenever I want. I'm choosing to take more risk and put it in the market because I think it would be hard for the market, especially if I use a little bit of common sense and caution, it'd be hard for the market to provide less of a return than my savings account right now. Uh, Even if the market goes down.
0% interest.
Yeah. It is just not super, and I think that's by design. I think they lower interest rates to encourage people to invest in the market. Anyways. All right. So, we talked about the can I pick. We talked about limiting, there's a potential to make 660% returns if you grab the great company, but there's also, but you might not pick right. So you cap your downside. I personally capped mine at around 10%. So if I invest just in this whole thing, I'm not going to go more in these individual companies. And then I'm going to put a pretty hefty percentage into equities. And I'm following increasingly on this side, I'm looking more at equal weighting. So I'm looking at value. I'm looking at small cap. I'm going to give you some tickers. I'm not trying to encourage you to do those. I think people fundamentally have trouble understanding what equal weight really means. And I think this is demonstrative of kind of the concept. So you can see that if you have something that can maintain the logic that you've used, it's not as complicated as it actually sounds to do this. So leaning heavily on Paul Merriman, I mean, using almost verbatim, you can actually literally look for Paul Merriman's portfolios. I'm going to give you a couple tickers that he has included in there. So let me give you a few of these tickers. And, again, this disclaimer, I'm not recommending these individual funds. I just want to give you an example of what comprised the pies that Paul Merriman talks about. So you kind of have a general understanding of where this fits in the logic that I was telling you about being kind of equally distributed. So let's just mention, I'm going to mention 6 or 7 different tickers, and I'm explaining just a couple of them for you. VIOO, IJS, VONV, VSS, VEA, and there's a few more. VOO, which is the S&P 500, BWO, et cetera. So I will go through these. Please reference the article. I just want to kind of show you these are index funds in most of the cases. VIOO is the Vanguard S&P Small Cap 600 Index Fund. So companies that have a market capitalization under a certain amount are going to fall in this. And then this index fund just tracks those and does so relatively inexpensively. The other one I mentioned, IJS, is the Small Cap 600 Value. So there's some extra, I guess, rules or structure around that. So companies that are perceived to be at a discount. And then you have the VONV, which is the 1000 Value Index Fund. Even as I'm saying this, I can tell I'm probably going to be putting most of you to sleep. And so I'm not going to read all of these tickers out. You can just check out Paul Merriman's. He's done so much work. I couldn't possibly cover what he's actually done. But the idea here is, instead of us just picking one index that's cap weighted, let's put together a stack of about 5 to 12. I think in some of it, the ultimate buy and hold portfolio, I think actually concluded 12 funds. I think some of them may be actively managed, but really low fees compared to the market. The most of them were index funds, uses a lot of Vanguard funds. And what these do is these equally distribute the way that you're invested, throughout all of the different size companies, value, and I guess you'd call them premium companies. So that's kind of what I took a look at for the equity side of thing, Brad. And the point here is, like, if you believe what worked really well this year is going to be what's going to work every year going forward, this is a horrible strategy. But if you want to be as diversified as possible, and you want to, weight among all of the different companies somewhat in a more even manner without getting into the weeds and picking them, then maybe there's a little bit more here. Now, Brad, I think we actually have Paul Merriman joining us on the show early next year to talk about a little bit more of this in his new book.
Yeah, that'll be exciting. Paul is going to come on, I think at the end of January is when we have it tentatively scheduled for. So yeah, he'll be on in the next 6 weeks or so, which will be interesting to talk about, especially now that you have been investing like this, right? And I think, I'm a little, I think I always skew more towards simplicity. And I'm not saying that's good, bad, or indifferent, right? I'm not trying to really compare it to your strategy. It's just, for me, the simplicity of total stock market index fund works, but I need to be aware, and I think we all do, that we're always making decisions, right? Like, and in essence, we're always stock picking. Like, I think a lot of us, myself certainly included, say, I don't want to pick stocks. I don't want to try to time things. I don't have the ability to do that. But I think one thing that you've been trying to make clear over the last couple of weeks that we've been doing this is you are stock picking to a large degree by investing in S&P 500, right? Sure, it's 500 huge firms, but almost a third of the money that you're investing is in those top 10 companies, right? So whether you like to believe it or not, you are picking those top 10 companies to a large degree. So I think if you're 100% intellectually honest, and that's what I'm trying to be here, like, I'm understanding that I am making that choice. So I clearly see what you're trying to do by spreading this out a little bit. But I think it's always easy to come up with narratives after the fact, right? Like, you could always say, like, oh, these small caps got destroyed this year. They're on sale. They're set to make a comeback. But you could equally make an argument that, wow, maybe the largest firms are just going to continue consolidating, right? Like, there's an equally compelling case for that.
You're
So
exactly
that's why I
right.
try not, right? Isn't that so interesting? Like, bricks and mortar are just still going to be decimated, right? Like, you can make a compelling counter argument for a lot of this stuff, which is why, like, I don't love to get into this, but again, I am perfectly being as intellectually honest as I can possibly be, saying, like, I am making a choice,
Yeah.
an investing decision, by being in a total stock market index fund, and that means a quarter of my money is going into 10 companies, plain and simple.
And the only thing I would add on to what you just said, because you're exactly right, it's what is the narrative? Your belief has to be based on one of those two narratives. The only thing I would slightly push back on is the simplicity aspect. Like, to the point where I was reading people the tickers, it sounded complex. But in reality, with something like M1 Finance, it's a button click. It's, do you want to do the simple path, which is just one fund, or do you want to do it ultimate buy and hold portfolio, which is one button click that then represents a series of other choices that you're making, and then it just maintains it for you. So I think it's kind of, I don't think it's as complex as it. I mean, in reality, in implementation now with the platforms that we have, it actually isn't. So then what it comes down to is, well, if they're both actually pretty simple in terms of just picking and going, then the real question is, which narrative do you believe is actually going to play out? It's actually not simplicity versus complexity. They're both actually pretty complex. The simple path to wealth is a very complex algorithm that's taking place to manage 3,000 companies at the exact percentage that's being portrayed by the market at all times. This is that plus an extra tiny little bit to then break it up and move the money in an equal fashion. It's, the most complex part about it is one is called the simple path and the other is called the ultimate buy and hold portfolio. They're quite literally the same amount of work to implement on your behalf, which then it comes back to, what is the narrative? All right. I have one more piece to this, which I would like to, I'll talk about right now, but I think you're exactly right in terms of identifying, you can sell the counterpoint as well. And it's a very compelling counterpoint. Last piece that I wanted to mention, I just wanted to come back to, is the negative correlation. And this is only important because I do not have an emergency fund. And well, I don't like the way that sounded. I do have an emergency fund. This is my emergency fund. I have a six-figure, emergency fund. It's my taxable investments. Well, how do I want to allocate that to make sure that if something bad goes down, I can access it? So it actually has a two-prong approach here. So first of all, I have this pie. So I said there were three pies. I said there was a negative correlation pie, which is what I wanted. Frank said in that episode, which we'll reference here very, very shortly, he said you can have alternate investments for like one of three different reasons: stability, income, or negative correlation, meaning when the market goes down, it goes up. So this negative correlation pie is one piece. The can I pick pie is my fund money. That's my second piece. And then my equities using the ultimate buy and hold portfolio is the third piece. All of these kind of play pretty nice together. The negative correlation, I had to go through my own series of choices. And again, please, I've done a disclaimer after disclaimer. It's because I'm giving you specifics, but only for the purposes of sharing my mindset, not for the purpose of getting you to do exactly what I'm doing. Frank talked about in the episode, Brad, I know I've mentioned a couple times now. What episode is this with Frank?
Yeah, that was episode 194.
An amazing episode. It's an incredible episode. It needs to go on our essential listening list. It needs to be passed along. Everybody should listen to it. Now, Frank basically said that in 2008, he got hammered and he didn't like that pain. And so he wanted to come up with an alternative that wouldn't be as painful or would act differently than it did in 2008. And so Frank started looking around. He looked into the all-weather portfolio, which I think is a Ray Dalio portfolio, and a couple other ideas. And he stumbled onto a couple tools that you could use, like portfolio charts and some others. It's all mentioned in that episode, all linked up. You can check that out. And basically what he said he wanted to happen is he's willing to sacrifice some returns in the short term. But what he wanted is if the stock market goes down, meaning people are fleeing the market, they're taking their money out of the market, he wanted to have something in his portfolio that would go up. So the logic here, it's not just an accident that happens. When people flee the market, they don't feel like they're safe in the market. Where do they put their money? And Frank was in this episode saying, that there's a bunch of different instruments that can be used. One, we could just talk about bonds as this generic term, but really there's a ton of different types of bonds. You could have corporate bonds, you could have junk bonds, you could have US treasuries. These are debt instruments, tools that institutions like our government or like companies will pay you a set amount of interest to hold them over a period of time. And people will flee the stock market to the potentially relative safety of these when stocks are going down, because they also recognize that that savings accounts aren't really doing a whole lot, right? That's the idea. And so when a bunch of people try to get into something that you're already in, it goes up. And then he also mentioned precious metals like gold, silver, platinum, maybe there's others, as being another one. And we can also track the logic on this. People get out of companies and they want to go to something that they perceive as maybe stable or as a store of value. And so they will also invest in gold and silver. Gold and silver do not produce additional profit, right? They're not businesses. They don't return. There's no interest. It's just someone now at a crazy point in time is willing to pay more for it than they were when things all felt really good and they were invested in companies. So the price of those items, those commodities, I guess, goes up. That's it. It's potentially a store of value. And so with that in mind, he gave a couple tickers in that episode. I just kind of particularly latched on to some of the precious metals, actually. So I thought about the bonds, the corporate bonds, but in particular with corporate bonds, like if a company's net worth is going down, especially like we saw in March, corporate bonds, which are debt instruments from that company, they also go down a little bit, just not as much, right? They go down just not as much. Historically, people go into US treasuries because the treasuries, they pay a higher interest rate. People have a confidence in the US government. And so that credibility, people will flee there for the better interest rate that they're making in these government funds than they were making in savings account. Now, I'm not an expert in all of these, but I mean, I feel like the government just sent their interest rate to zero. Like they kind of just burned all of their juice out this last time around. So I was like, well, would they do it again? Maybe, probably gonna be better than stocks, probably gonna be relatively safe, but I don't totally know how all that works. So I talked to my wife and we decided that at least for us, at least in the short term, because again, this is our emergency fund, we were going to put a little bit more into some of these precious metals like gold, silver, and platinum. And so I was just again referencing some of the stuff that Frank had done and other conversations that had happened in our group. And we decided to put a percentage in this negative correlation pie into gold. And I think we picked GLDM for our gold, silver, SLV for our silver, and platinum, PPLT for our platinum. Recognizing these are not probably necessarily profitable in the long term. They're not businesses. They don't spit off high returns. But, if things kind of go sideways for a period of time, at least in the short term, people tend to historically flee to these types of instruments. And so this is our emergency fund. This is our emergency fund piece right here. And it's kind of different. Consider this again. This is a test. I'm a long-term buy and hold investor, and we have a lot invested in just companies of all specters, all spectrums. But
Sectors, I
sectors.
think might be the word you're.
Thank you, Brad, coming in for the save. We have a lot of diversity already. But for our emergency fund, when is an emergency fund? An emergency fund is going to be used in an emergency. One of the emergencies that I perceive is if something happens where I can't run my businesses or business goes sideways. Typically, our business in particular is tied to just the general economy, and that would be the biggest emergency. If something happens to the economy, affects the business, reduces our income, in that case, I could see this thesis playing out that I'd be happy that I had something in these types of instruments. So this is what we decided. We agreed on it. It makes sense. If it turns out 2 or 3 years from now that the market has just gone straight up, then this small percentage of our net worth was not in the market. It was in these commodities. And we will not have gotten as much of a return as we could have if we were in it. But my wife and I decided we're okay with that because this fund, this taxable investment, is also serving as our emergency fund. And it's just doing it, hopefully, in a more effective way than a savings account. Brad, I'm kind of vetting this off you just a little bit here. I'm not expecting you to, I know you're not doing the exact same thing as me, and we don't have the exact same investing strategy, but at least from a logical perspective, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think the negative correlation makes sense. I think you can make a compelling argument for that. I know, obviously, we consider Frank one of the most intelligent people we've ever met in our entire lives. I know Ray Dalio talks about that significantly, about having uncorrelated asset classes. So yeah, I mean, that I totally understand. As you certainly know, I'm not a big believer in gold, to put it mildly. But that's but one of many examples. That's kind of missing the forest for the trees, right? If I were to harp on that one particular thing, I think for me, it's like in the zombie apocalypse, which is what you're talking about essentially. Like gold is just a cute little trinket. So I think that's like my again little forest for the trees thing. But the larger point of negative correlation, I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I mean, it's something I think we need to look into more. I think we both should probably consider studying up on what Ray Dalio talks about, learning more from Frank. I mean, I think there's a lot of potential that we can do with this concept, as opposed to just saying like, okay, we have this one simple path and we're going to keep that for the next 50 years. I think that's always my kind of MO is I want to learn as much as I can, and then I make determinations from there. So at this point, I have made no significant changes, but again, always willing to learn.
What you just said is actually perfect because I've had that thought for a long time, and I still agree with it. Like in a zombie apocalypse, my dad was actually talking to me. He's like, "Hey, Jonathan, do you have any physical gold?" And I was like, "Why? What are you going to do with it? Going to chip it off
Lug
and
it
go
around.
take it to the neighbor, lug it around?" Like I know people that have bought physical gold, and you see it all the time. These are the commercials that happen endlessly. Like, "Hey, buy your your amazing special edition token, and you can have it, and you can store." Like, what the hell are you going to do with physical gold in your like? I totally get that. Totally, and I'm never going to own physical gold, despite all the commercials telling me how I need to have it. But what I do think is different is in a zombie apocalypse, there's probably a loss of confidence in most governments, most fiat currencies, right? I mean, I don't remember like what was that show on AMC? What's it called? Help me out, somebody. The Walking Dead. Like
Yeah, yeah.
what fiat currency is are people super excited that they have that fiat currency? They don't, and not that gold's really helping them at that point either. But in the short term, to get there, people probably are to some degree fleeing fiat currencies and they are potentially moving. And actually, I don't know whether that's the case or not. This is a theoretical conversation. But what I was going to say is, here's the thing. When you start talking about Armageddon plans, and Armageddon investing and all these types of things, right? These are where the snakes come out. Like, you think that the expense ratios are high on just an actively managed fund? Wait till someone takes advantage of your fear and tells you that they have your back. Watch how expensive those fees are. Watch the snakes in the grass that come out to tell you you don't have anything to fear because we're going to help you. Those are the individuals. I mean, they prey on your fear and they charge insane expense ratio. And that's why these types of conversations, before it gets scary, I'm not saying it is, but before it gets scary, before that happens, to kind of start to research your options and play out your theory of what might happen and know how to do so in a low cost way. I should have mentioned that was a big part of what I was looking for here is I'm not going to buy physical gold. I'm not going to have gold sitting in my house. Like, imagine you have $2 million worth of gold and then someone finds out. What the hell are you going to do? Like, that's not a viable strategy. It doesn't. But recognizing like that humans might might suddenly get more excited about that and be competing to buy that. They might be willing to pay a premium for it. But then part two of that is, great, okay, I decided I want to put a small portion in there just so I can have this hedge. Where should I do it? There's so many sharks out there. Doing a little research and finding out how you can invest in some of these in a way that doesn't require you, one, store it in your basement, but not beneath the firewood stove. Not that I'm telling anybody that that's where my gold that I don't have is.
Your fictional gold.
Yeah, my fictional gold. And how to do it in a way that doesn't involve ridiculous 1% or 2% assets under management fees is huge. And so these are why I got a lot of value from kind of listening to Frank. And the last piece, and this is something that still the verdict is out. I'm not super confident in bonds, like personally. I've never have been. It's just like, maybe. And it does but that's something that I'm still personally looking into. And Frank, his episode on that is fantastic. And he certainly has done the research. So even what I'm saying personally is not exactly what Frank is doing. He puts a lot more into EDV, which I think is extended duration, basically treasury bonds. And then there's another one that he mentions in that episode as well. And the thesis that Frank rolls out is that, I just talked about precious metals. Frank says, historically, throughout all the time, when people flee the market, they flee to the safety and relatively better interest of U.S. treasuries. And so if you have a small amount for negative correlation in these, when the market goes down, just like it did in March, these went flying up. And I think he said at the time we recorded that episode, since March, those were up like 26% or something like that in the case of EDV just since March. So understanding that these different things are out there, these tools are out there, and they react differently to market conditions. It may feel like an advanced conversation, which is why you want to start with how to start setting up your financial life. And then you want to start getting more confident with the tools that are out there. And then the investing tools that are out there. What do I want to invest on? Why am I investing the way that I'm investing? What's my long-term, medium-term, and short-term mindset? And I think that's honestly, Brad, that's the biggest difference. Are we talking about money for 40 years? Are we talking about money for 30 years? Are you talking about money for 10 years or money that we're going to need in 5 years or less? This is 5 years or less money for me. So it has a different risk tolerance than money that is for, that I'm saving over a 40-year period of time.
Nice. Yeah. And I think that is the summary, right? For everybody out there, it's have those conversations. Like you said, Jonathan, I'm trying to encapsulate the real significant lessons for everybody is have those conversations with your spouse, significant other, loved ones, and do it ahead of time. Do it understanding your timeline and your risk tolerance, and then make decisions from a point of rationality as opposed to emotion, right? We've seen what emotion can do earlier this year. So I think to me, that is always good advice, regardless of what you ultimately decide on. And this is from you, Jonathan, very specifically to you more broadly for the listener is, at the end of the day, I don't really particularly care what you decide to invest in, you individually, but you're doing it from this point of, okay, we're gonna go through this. I'm gonna learn what I can. I'm going to take that with all the information that I've learned to this point and understanding my own psychology, and I'm gonna move forward rationally. And that's a perfectly plausible thing for everyone out there to consider on a regular basis. And frankly, what a better time to do it than at year end? A year end review just for your life is a pretty useful thing, and your financial life very specifically.
And what's cool, Brad, is we get opportunities like this, it seems like every 4 or 5 years. It's actually been closer to a decade now since the last time we get a test run of this. This is me as an adult now that is responsible for not only my own finances but for that of my family. I have kids. This is my first time having gone through something like this, and I could tell you, like, you get wiser the longer that you do this. I mean, you get whatever happened in March made all of us wiser about what our risk tolerance is and what we would have confidence in going forward. And guess what? This isn't going to be the last time we're going to have to deal with something like this. Probably every 4 or 5 years, 8 to 10 years, something is going to test our mettle, test our confidence, test our battle plan. And the goal here is for us to never wake up and panic and say we now have to start from scratch. We have to start over because we made a really dumb move out of fear. We now have to start from scratch. And that's it. I mean, that's it. And the good thing is, by having these conversations now, by battle testing things, by thinking, what if it goes well? What if it goes wrong? What if I'm wrong? What's the worst that can happen? By thinking through these types of scenarios, you're not going to have that regret. You're going to be in a phenomenal place. You're going to build lasting wealth over time. Get rich quick is usually a scam. It ends up with your money in someone else's pocket. But you can get rich slowly every single time by following the plan. Following the plan. All right, everyone, that is going to bring this episode to a close. Now, as you know, we like to finish every episode by just sharing wins from our community. These are people that are on our newsletter that get this once a week newsletter from Brad. And they in this newsletter, Brad just asks, like, what is one action step? What's one win that you've gotten this week? And we get hundreds of responses, and we share some of those on our Friday roundups. And what we actually do is we do a drawing as well. If your win is selected as one that we're sharing with the audience, we would like to offer you one of our books from ChooseFI Publishing as a free gift to you, either for yourself or to share with a friend or a family member. We have several books that we can offer. There's our book, ChooseFI, Your Blueprint to Financial Independence. We have a book on pensions for those of you that are trying to figure out, is it worth it to stay or is it worth it? For those of you that have kids, you're looking at second generation financial independence. How do you raise money savvy kids? And the Simple Startup book, which is an entrepreneurship book really aimed at young adults, teenagers, 8-year-olds all the way through young adults. And if you're selected, please just let us know which one you want, and we would love to get that out to you. Again, if you want to be on the newsletter, if you want to submit your wins as a response to that newsletter, just go to choosefi.com/start. Very easy to get on the newsletter and be a part of that drawing. So, Brad, how many wins do we have today?
All right, Jonathan, we've got 2 today. And the first is from Chris. And Chris said, my wife and I recently became debt-free and continue to max out my 401k, HSA, and both of our IRAs. This week, we began investing into an index fund and a taxable account, as well as upped our contribution to our son's 529 accounts. We're super excited about the opportunity to build multi-generational wealth for us and our family. That's awesome. I love the second generation FI and just thinking about that multi-generational wealth. That's really remarkable.
You know where second generation FI really starts? It starts with teaching your kids how to handle money. And when you have a 2-year-old, it involves making sure they don't swallow the pennies and the nickels. That's the step that we're on right now. It seems to be going well. We're keeping close eyes on it, though. Congratulations, guys.
All right. And the next email here is from Kang. And Kang wrote in, thanks for the weekly emails. On Sunday, I got an email from my internet provider with my increased bill due in December going from $50 to $70. I decided to do the online chat option on Monday to see if I could get the bill to go down. A tip for you listeners, do online chat so you're doing it at your own pace, and it seems to be easier to connect with the representatives. The first customer service rep didn't help very much. They wanted to give me lower speeds for $55. I tried a second customer service rep, and they got me a better deal with more speed. Wow. The bill will be just $45 and I'll get 33% more speed than what I'm getting now. I'm just so jazzed to share this with you because I'm reminded by ChooseFI that we should try to do better. In this case, and this is the part that I love, Jonathan, in this case, it's a never ask, never know type of thing. Or in other words, never ask, always a no, right? If you never ask, it's always going to be a no. This is one of the big takeaways that I've seen from the FI Weekly and the responses is people just love that concept of everything is negotiable. And it's amazing how many people are taking action, just being emboldened by that other people are out there just saying, hey, look, it never hurts to ask. And I just love this from Kang. Never ask is always a no. So They said, thanks for always encouraging us, Brad. You and Jonathan are very appreciated, and I'm always happy to know that you're doing quite well.
That's awesome.
How great is that?
He's got it locked in. All right, my friends, the fire is spreading. We'll see you next time as we continue to go down the road less traveled.